Good evening, everyone. My name is Steve Seitz, here with Book Talk, and tonight we have a notable Vermont author with us, as we almost always do. This is Joe Citro, who is probably the best chronicler of the strange side of Vermont that we've ever had. Certainly, he's made a specialty of it. Novels, little historical tidbits, you name it, and Joe probably knows about it. So why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself first and what we're working on today?
Well, where to start?
How did you get into this?
I was born in Vermont. What growing up I've done, I did in Vermont. My father was quite interested in Vermont oddities, and so I got early exposure to some of the stranger components to the area where I grew up around Chester. And as I got older, I thought, well, maybe some of these stories had some traction that would work in fiction. And so I wrote a series of novels, 5 novels, having to do with Vermont oddities, Vermont folklore, and kind of oddball Vermont historical fiction. Somewhere along the way, I realized that the stories that I collected really outnumbered the novels I was going to be able to write in this life. So I decided that I would just collect the stories. And I discovered that no one had ever done that before.
That's amazing, isn't it?
Yeah.
It seems so obvious.
Yeah, no one had done it. No one had collected, the ghost stories, the monster stories, the treasure tales, and on and on, in a single volume. No one writer had done that. So I got sort of a sense of mission about it, and so I wanted to be the one who would collect the stories, and I'm still working on it. Every time I start to see the bottom of the barrel, it starts filling up again.
Yeah, I never even told you about my family.
Well, we can talk about that, Stephen.
Not on camera. What's your current project? What are you working on now?
Well, I'm working on a kind of an interesting project with an artist, a Vermont artist by the name of Robert Brunel. And it's going to be kind of a collaboration, a collection of stories with his illustrations, but it's different in the sense that generally when a book is illustrated, they're 2 independent processes. The writer writes the book, and some editor will turn that book over to an illustrator and contract for, maybe 5 illustrations or whatever. Robert and I are working hand in hand, if you will, not literally, but we're creating the stories and the pictures as a collaboration. So it'll come out not like a graphic novel, but a thoroughly illustrated series of stories about the odder side of Vermont's history. And I found some stories that are, as far as I know, are unpublished, and I found some old ones that might have been published a long time ago, but essentially they're lost to the folk memory. And Robert is giving vision to those, perhaps for the first time ever. So interesting process. We've been at it maybe a year now, and we had some notion that we were going to get the book out by this Halloween, but that would be a miracle.
Yeah, I know. I'm having the same problem. I was hoping I'm finishing up finally my current novel, and I was hoping to have it ready by now.
Yeah,
it's in time for the full holiday season, but November is looking a lot more likely.
Yeah, or next Halloween.
And there's always that possibility too. So now, tell me some of these surprises. What are some of the more interesting stories that you've unearthed?
Well, it's funny. I mean, they're all interesting, but in different ways. Some of them are supernatural stories, and some of them are just historical strangeness. Like, well, I would even count the St. Albans raid among the weird stories, although it's been written often.
Yeah, but it's a bizarre story.
It's a bizarre story that the northernmost conflict of the Civil War was actually in St. Albans, Vermont.
Yeah.
There's one that I've been having a lot of fun with. It's a story of kind of a maverick religious movement that took place around Middleton, or as it's now called, Middleton Springs, where a guy named Nathaniel Wood started communicating essentially with a dowsing rod. And for some reason, he became convinced or decided that the dowsing rod was communicating messages from God.
Why not? If I can talk to a burning bush, I see no reason.
Well, he was able to convince a number of people that this rod was actually God, and was able to give them directions and give them advice and find treasures, allegedly. And at one point, the rod decided that the parishioners should build a temple. So they set to work in Middleton or somewhere near there, building a temple. And then the rod, fickle as he was, decided, well, no, forget that. The end of the world's coming, so we might as well turn our attention to that. So, well, essentially that's the end of the dramatic part of the story, at least the part that I want to tell right now. But the interesting thing is that there was a temple, but now nobody knows exactly where it was or what it looked like. So Robert Brunel is given the opportunity to illustrate what that temple might have looked like, or the beginning of the temple. That's a pretty interesting story. It doesn't involve ghosts. It may involve something supernatural. I don't think it was really God communicating through the hazel stick, but who knows?
Well, it seems to me that God's probably got better things to do myself.
Well,
but that's,
we could keep him busy.
Yeah, that's true. We can certainly do that. And what about the spring? So you now live in Windsor. You used to live in Burlington. You now live in Windsor.
Yeah.
And so does this mean you're paying more attention to this area of the state in your research?
Well, I try to spread my attention out, but this area of the state is just full of fascinating things, and Windsor is a particularly historical area with a lot of odd stories attached. One of the weirdest stories I ever found took place in Windsor. Back in the early 50s, a doctor and his wife and their 2 daughters discovered that after living in their house on Cherry Street for 11 years with no problems, the house started to produce water. And at first it was just a puddle here and there. But that accelerated. In the first couple of days after the water started to flow, they cleaned up like 13 buckets of water in 2 days. And it continued. It became sort of a geyser. It was, they found that it was filling up cups and glasses and saucers in their cabinets. It was actually flowing down the stairs like a waterfall, covered the top of their piano. And they were calling in all sorts of people. There was a very well-known local plumber named Tom Levesque, who was the first on the site, and he couldn't find where the water was coming from. He turned off the water at the street, at the main, within the house. There were no pipes bursting. There was no springs that were feeding into the house. He and many others examined it, and there simply was no source of the water, and yet it continued to accumulate to the point that the doctor and his family had to move out. And they took a mobile home or trailer or something like that and put it in their front yard and moved into that. The water didn't follow them into the trailer, but continued to flow in the house. They were getting inquiries from all around the world. People were deciding it was a miracle, or it was some message from Satan, or something. They were describing it in all sorts of supernatural terms. The doctor released a number of press releases while the thing was in progress, but then decided that was a mistake because it was really bringing too much attention to them. And so he issued another press release saying that the problem had been solved. But it never had been solved. It just stopped. It began in early October, as I recall, or late September, and ended about the beginning of November. About 1 month of flooding, no explanation at all. If you look for little bits of kind of frightening synchronicity, there might be one in the fact that the doctor and his family were named Waterman. So be careful of your last name and its meaning, I guess. That's probably one of the most strange stories that I've come across I've talked to people who were witnesses. There's no question that it happened. Other stories like the.
Well, we both grew up in Chester. In fact, I think you and I just missed each other in the public school system.
That's right. You're a lot older than I am.
Yeah. Yeah, my cane's under the table, everybody.
No, I think I've got a few years on you.
But Chester is a fountain for this stuff.
Yeah, and probably some that that we haven't even discovered yet. My favorite, of course, is the story of Clarence Adams, the man who played detective, and he was always one of my childhood heroes because he chose to solve a series of burglaries around town. There were a number of houses were being broken into, a number of businesses. The railroad station was robbed frequently. You know this story?
Yeah, I've heard it, but there are a lot. But there are a lot. And Chester's a different town from when I was living there. So
yeah, well, this happened in probably the last decade of the 19th century into the first decade of the 20th century. It went on for about 16 years. These robberies, they were unsolved. There was just some phantom that was loose in the area. And the head selectman, Clarence Adams, was a student like you and me of Sherlock Holmes and weird goings on, and he liked detective and adventure novels, and he was the one who chose the books for the library. He decided to volunteer to solve the crimes. So you have a local hero stepping forth to solve this series of burglaries. And what eventually happened, to make a long story short, is that he was really looking for himself. He was committing the burglaries by night and trying to solve them by day. And when he was eventually brought to trial in Woodstock, part of his statement was that he wanted to encourage both sides of his personality. So he encouraged what we might call the good side and became a legislator from Chester, and a trustee in the bank, and a library trustee, I guess it's called, the person who picked the books for the library. And at the same time, he became one of the state's, if not the state's, main criminal. And he kept this crime wave going for 16 to 20 years.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think I might have even written a paper on that way back in middle school.
Yeah, I would hope it came to your attention at some point.
Yeah, well, we left Chester when I was in the 8th grade, 7th grade actually. So, after that I was in Brattleboro for years. But anyway.
Well, did you go to the school that's right by the graveyard, the old academy?
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. That's where we used. That's where we used to avoid gym class.
It's where Clarence went to school.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Well, what about Springfield? Since we are in Springfield, do you have anything?
Well, I'm not always great on rapid recall on these things. I mean, I've read so many of them. There's a couple of things that interest me, but I haven't really torn into them. One is that there's a strange structure up by the, is it the Miller Art Gallery? Is that? Yeah. There's a strange stone structure connected to that. And last time I talked to the people up there, they didn't have any idea why it was there, who built it, or why. It could be as recent as mid-1800s and part of an underground railroad route that came through Springfield, or it could be vastly older.
Yeah.
There are a number of structures throughout the state and all around New England that are controversial, to say the least. Some people think they're colonial, but a fair number of people believe that they predate that maybe by thousands of years. So some of these structures might be 10,000 years old, pre-Columbian by far.
Wow.
And those are around. Trying to think, there's an interesting legend, and I really would like to underscore legend here, that there's a series of tunnels under the Hartness House. Now we know there's a tunnel that connects the Hartness House with the observatory. We know that's there, and we know there's an underground room that was an office. But there are also allegedly other tunnels, one of which connected the Hartness House with downtown Springfield.
Yeah.
And I've been looking for that. I've been looking for that entrance and not finding it. And it may be there and it may not. I tend to believe there's something there because once when I was visiting the Hartness house, the owner was giving me a tour of the place, and he opened up a door and he said, "This is the tunnel." And I could see a chain of dim electric lights kind of vanishing off into the distance, and everything else was black. But he wouldn't let me go in. He said the reasons were, he said, well, first there was a problem with insurance if I went in there. And second, he said there were snakes in there. I didn't care if there were snakes in there. That wasn't going to
well, those snakes around here, I mean, they're pretty harmless.
Yeah. I think the last person to be bitten by a timber rattler was back in the late 1950s.
Something like that, yeah.
Yeah, so we're pretty immune to those. But that tunnel did vanish in the distance, farther than I could see, and I don't know what it led to. So I remain curious about that. Maybe somebody knows. Somebody who's watching this maybe knows a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I'd be curious about that myself.
Yeah.
So, well, I'm trying to think of something you haven't covered before. Well, this is the time of year for vampire stories.
Yeah.
We know about the one in Guilford. We know about the one in Woodstock. Are there any others besides those two?
Well, I think there was this random access recall is a little difficult. There were a lot of cases that were kind of retroactively described as vampire cases that were, we didn't really use the word vampire.
No, they would say revenant.
Around the